What do you think it means when one of the richest little countries in the world bought a record amount of gold in 1 month? That piqued my curiosity. So I started to learn about this country, and there are some fascinating facts that I want to share with you in this video about the country, but we also need to look at why are they buying so much gold. And on top of that, if you grew up in the era that I did, you probably heard a popular urban legend, a story about this country. Is that story true? We're going to cover that and a lot more, you and me, right now. So do you think maybe somebody misnamed the country? Instead of Singapore, maybe they should have named it Singa-Rich. Because we got news that in January of this year, the Central Bank of Singapore, their version of the United States Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, the Singapore version of that, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, they increased their gold holdings by 45 metric tons. That is a 30% increase in the gold holdings by the Central Bank of Singapore. But when you learn about Singapore and how rich this country is and everything going on with Singapore, the fact that they're buying gold becomes very interesting. Do you think maybe it's a good idea to follow what rich people and rich countries do? And when we're talking about Singapore, we're talking about a very wealthy country. Did you know that the average income in Singapore is higher than that in rich countries like Germany and Japan? That Singapore is amongst one of the most expensive cities in the world to live. Higher than London, higher than New York City here in the United States of America. And what's even more interesting is that Singapore, if you want to drive an automobile, it's the most expensive country in the world in which to own a car. And I don't want you to worry. We're going to talk about why their gold purchases are so significant on many levels. But first, let's talk about this urban legend. If you're like from the vintage that I am, it seemed like in the 80s and 90s, I heard this story a couple times about Singapore, that if you got caught spitting out gum or littering, that you could be arrested and jailed and whipped with a stick, all types of fantastic stories. Well, I dug in, and here's what I found out. They do indeed. If you're in Singapore, keep your gum in your mouth and your candy wrappers in your pocket, right? When you finish your Snickers bar, put the wrapper in your back pocket, because if you accidentally were to drop it on the ground, the first time you would be hit with a $2,000 fine. Now, let's say a week later, you forget again and drop another wrapper on the ground. Second offense, $4,000. Third offense, up to $10,000 fine for simple littering. And you have to do like a work program afterwards. So it's rather astounding. Thank you for giving me your time and joining me here in the basement. You might be in South Dakota. You might be in Singapore. If you are in Singapore, let us know what it's like there. But from wherever you are, it's you and me right now. I hope you feel like you found a friend, a little home away from home, a refuge from the storm, and I want you to come back. If you pull out your world map, what you'll see is that Singapore is a tiny country. But this is also a very, very wealthy country with an undeniable track record of economic success over the last decades. They have close ties still with England. They're located in a geographically desirable area for trade. It didn't really make sense to me. I read that like where they're located, they're a good spot between Europe and Asia. But when I looked at the map, I didn't see it. You tell me what you think about that. Nonetheless, this is a channel about gold and silver. Why did they buy all this gold? 45 metric tons, a 30% increase in gold. Well, maybe, just maybe, they see coming down the line what all the countries in the world are seeing coming down the line. It seems, except for the United States, the Western G7 countries, But all the other countries, aren't they buying a ton of gold? We know China's stocking up on gold. We know India's stocking up on gold and silver, by the way. The world is splitting, right? There's this new order coming into play. Bifurcation, right? That's our fancy word of the day. We're going to learn that by the end of the year. The world is bifurcating, and we know that it's likely new world reserve currencies are going to be established, and people are talking about how that will very likely be backed by gold, silver, other real assets. We'd like to thank our sponsor, First Mining Gold. They're a Canadian gold developer with 2 world-class projects in Canada. They also have a handful of other projects. When you total up all the gold in their resources, it comes to over 12 million ounces. They're worth checking out. I'll put a link to the company's website in the description below. And have you noticed? This subject matter is not being reported on the mainstream media. Now, every time somebody like Warren Buffett makes any type of financial move, it's like headline, top story type information. But what about a country like Singapore that has an undeniable amount of wealth already and a proven track record of success? Isn't it smart for us to pay attention what they're doing with precious metals right now? Not to mention the rest of the world. You know this already. But 2022, the world central banks, let me remind you, because it feels good for us to hear this. The world central banks, the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world, they bought a record amount of gold in 2022. And I will bang the table reminding you that they bought more gold last year than 1950. And back then, we were on the gold standard. What is that telling us? What is it telling us when we hear about Singapore buying this record amount of gold? Well, of course, gold, it's just a barbarous relic, right? Have you heard that one? Or a tradition. I think it was Ben Bernanke who said that. Well, you know what? We'll find out. Hey, thanks for joining me here in the basement. I'll see you next time. You be well.